Many folks do know me. I also am affiliated with the .NET Foundation. I run the marketing community for the .NET Foundation. And I have swag. So I have some pens here, which are .NET and AWS pens, if you want one. I have cache of stickers. You can come up during my talk if you want and be that person who's sorry. But I have a real piece of swag. For one lucky individual, it is a .NET belt. But there's some participation here. So I want everybody to raise your hand. Okay? Everybody looked at me like, oh. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start naming versions of .NET Framework, starting at the latest version of .NET Framework and moving down. And the last person that has their hand up, we can all feel very, very sorry for them and share their victory of getting a belt. How's that sound? Mm-hmm. We're going to start with .NET Framework 4.8.1. Keep your hand up. 4.7, 4.5, 4.0, 3.5.
Is this whether or not we're still using that section?
You have to maintain it.
Oh,
today.
Which number? What are you on now?
4.5.
I'm on 4.7 now.
All right. So 4.5. Who is paying attention?
I thought you go down to what we're using.
In the back. They're paying attention. Let's try this again. I'm sorry, I didn't cue properly. If you are currently maintaining an application that is in a particular version of .NET Framework that is 4.8, raise your hand. And I'm going to start counting older versions. These are applications that you currently maintain. Are we all on the same agreement now? 4.7, 4.5, 4.0. It's a ton. Can you just like box in the hallway?
Who's it fit?
Yeah, that's a good question. How about this? How about this? One of you gets it, and the other one can contact me on Twitter, and I'll get one shipped to you.
Did you get down to 3.5?
No.
Okay.
Well,
you said raise your hand when you get to it.
No, I said put your hand up.
No, you said.
You
changed the rules.
Wait.
Raise your hand when you get to the one.
Dan, what did you put me in? Like,
I'm so sorry.
All the way from Seattle.
Welcome to England.
It's my fault.
So you're on 3.5?
Yeah.
Is anybody lower than 3.5? There you go, sir. Have a belt. All right! Now that we're all plumb exhausted, let's actually get on with the show. All right. So I've already talked a little bit about myself. Sorry about that. So what I want to start off with the conversation is, what is .NET today? So again, audience participation because everybody loves it. Who here has played around with modern .NET? .NET 5, .NET 6? Oh man, people from the UK are way cooler than people from the US. Usually, there's 3 people that are okay. So you all know the value proposition of .NET now, right? It runs on Linux. You can have multiple versions of it. Who here owns a Samsung TV? Your TV runs .NET. That's cool, right? But so the whole thing with .NET now is that it literally is this opportunity to build innovative applications with technology that is built for the devices that we use now in the modern world. Phones, tablets, devices this big, devices the size of a house. The real goal is to make the experience great for developers, but also great for our customers. Because innovative applications bring value to customers, right? But let's talk about a little bit about how we got here, right? So everybody here is probably familiar with this thing up at the top, right? This is .NET Framework. Has been around for 22-ish years, 23 years. And there's one big caveat to this version of .NET that is challenging in a modern world. And what do you think that is?
Windows only.
Windows only. Someone's been paying attention. Exactly. So during that time frame, that 20 plus years, tons of innovation was done building applications solely for Windows. Because there's a point in time where literally Windows was the only computer that people would buy, unless you were really cool and had a MacBook Pro. But during that, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a couple of pockets of we should build applications that run not just on Windows. Who here has heard of Xamarin and Mono, right? So a couple of cool developers decided, hey, we really like writing apps in C#. Let's actually rewrite .NET for Linux and for Mac. And that was the Mono project, Mono Runtime, started by some folks that ended up starting a company called Xamarin, which was then acquired by a company called Microsoft. Weird how things work out. About 5 or 6 years ago, actually it's probably about 10 years ago now, Microsoft saw all of the traction that was happening with the Mono project, with the Mono Runtime, and said, hey, we should probably take what's the best of .NET Framework and actually start to build our own cross-platform version of .NET, and that was called .NET Core. And at one point in time, like I mentioned, .NET, after the acquisition of Xamarin, Microsoft had 3 .NETs that they had to manage, right? They had .NET Framework, they had this .NET Core thing that they were working on, they had this Mono thing. So the idea is, let's actually take the best of all 3 of these different stacks and merge them in together to be one .NET going forward, right? And that's now .NET 7. So when you hear .NET, the idea is .NET Wave or .NET Modern is .NET 5, .NET 6, .NET 7, right? And it talks about all the value propositions that we were talking about earlier. What does this actually mean? So if you are building a .NET Framework application today, and you pay attention to .NET Conf, or you go to NBC London, or any other event, and people are talking about Blazor, and Maui, and all these cool things, you don't get to play with any of those things. But you get one thing that's very, very important if you're on the latest version of .NET Framework, which is support from Microsoft. And why do you think that the latest version of .NET has support from Microsoft? Legacy, that might be one, but there's one real big, it's built into Windows. And I think it would be really challenging for Microsoft to no longer support a product that ships in their operating system, right? But what that means is that if you're on the latest version of .NET, which I think as of today is 4.8.1, you can rest assured that you have support for 10 years or however long the support is. But you're always going to get bug patches, and you're going to get security fixes, but you're not going to get new features. When .NET Core came out, there was .NET Core 1, .NET Core 1.1, 2, 2.2, 3, and now the latest version is 3.1. And the .NET team got to a point where, hey, we need to up the version of .NET Core. And they could have gone to .NET Core 4, but why is that problematic?
Google search.
Because there's already a .NET Framework 4. So just imagine how awesome it would be if they decided to go forward with .NET Core 4, and we're like, how do I wire up an HTTP client in .NET 4? You're going to get stuff from 2017, or you're going to get stuff from 1997, right? Not a great experience for developers, right? So that was a problem. So what they did is they said, hey, we have this Mono project. That's kind of doing its own thing. There's a lot of great innovations been done, like ahead of time compiling, assembly trimming, all these sort of things. We should take some of that and put it into .NET Core, merge it into it. And
because naming is hard, let's just call it .NET 5. So going forward, so .NET 5 shipped in 2021? Yes. 2021. Nope, 2021 because odd numbers. Okay. Anyway, so .NET 5 ships, and then the next year, .NET 6 ships, and then in November of last year, November 2022, .NET 7 ships. So Microsoft has made this promise. Every year, November timeframe, there will be a version of .NET that comes out. And the idea is, if it is an even number, it's an LTS version, which stands for long-term support, which means that you get 3 years of support from the year it launches. So for instance, .NET 6, which shipped in 2021, has 3 years of support. So it runs out of support in 2024, end of 2024, right? If you're odd number, you have what's called STS, or standard term support, which is 18 months. So .NET 5 is outdated. It's actually no longer supported. So if you're on .NET 5, go to .NET 6. .NET 7, which was shipped last year, 2022, like 3 months ago, that's going to have 18 months of support as well. So we're looking at May of next year. By that point in time, there'll be a .NET 8, and then a .NET Strawberry Shortcake, and then a .NET Umbrella or Elephant or whatever, and then they'll come up with some cool names like Android does, and this won't be a problem anymore. But the point being is that Microsoft is trying very, very hard to make sure that upgrading from versions of .NET is not as challenging as it has been in the past. If anybody has gone from .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5, they know how painful it was, right? In a lot of cases. But going from .NET 5 to .NET 6 or even .NET 6 to .NET 7 is substantially less painful, because the hope is that if it's painless to do the upgrade, we're talking about upgrading a couple of files and maybe moving to some different method signatures that have been deprecated, they can always be on the latest. So even though this is LTS, Microsoft still really, really wants you to be on the latest versions, because for a lot of reasons. Performance increases, developer productivity, and a lot of other cool things, right? So the underlying goal that I want to pin from this is, if you can get to this version, get to this version. If you can get to this version, you can hang out here for 3 years and no one's going to make fun of you. But if you're still here, I'm going to make fun of you. Does that make sense? All right. So we've talked a little bit about a history lesson of .NET, which was really helpful. Raise your hand if you think this was helpful. That was my talk. Thank you so much. This is when it starts to get challenging. What's not in .NET 7? And the people that are probably in this room are like, I use this thing and I use this thing. Web Forms and WCF Server, right? Because at one particular point in time, Microsoft said, there is no better way to build applications than Web Forms, because it's just like WinForms but for web apps. WCF Server is amazing because look at all these different ways that you can build contracts to have web communication between different services. And then years later, they're like, oh, those things actually aren't that great. You should use these ones instead. However, we live in a modern world where there are modern alternatives. So who here has played around with Blazor, right? Who here has heard of Blazor? Okay. So for the folks who didn't raise their hand, what Blazor is it's to really oversimplify it, it gives you the opportunity to build applications with a front end and a back end all written in C# using Razor syntax and C#. So what that allows you to do is, in some particular scenarios, eliminate the need for JavaScript front-end frameworks like Angular, React, Vue, Knockout, whatever the other versions are. So there's value in that. However, this isn't like just take your web forms code and just port it over to ASP.NET Blazor. It's a rewrite. Same thing with WCF Server. WCF Server was very, very heavily pushed by Microsoft for like 2 years. And then everybody said use web APIs instead. However, now we have gRPC, which stands for literally nothing, because the G stands for nothing. Remote procedure call. What's interesting about gRPC is, if you didn't know this, it's like 10 to 12 times faster than web API, because it sends binary data over the wire instead of JSON or XML. So even though it is a rewrite, and potentially it might be startling at first, working with protofiles and things like that, if you care about performance, gRPC might be a great option for you. But if you really, really like the WCF, there is a WCF for you in .NET Core, or in .NET 5 and .NET 6 and .NET 7, and that's called Core WCF. So Core WCF is a community project, in quotes, which is a WCF port to the latest versions of .NET. The main contributors are Microsoft and another company. What company do you think that would be? My company. And why do you think my company cares a lot about Core WCF? Existing customers. So if we have existing customers that are using WCF and .NET Framework today, why is it advantageous for us to get them to .NET 6 and .NET 7? But there's one additional thing as a part of that that's really important. Hosting costs. So if I have a Windows box hosted in an Amazon Linux VM, or Amazon VM, is that problematic for Amazon? Don't pay licensing. So the idea that if we can help our customers get from Windows to Linux, it makes everybody happy. We're recording this, right? Shit. Hopefully nobody's watching. But anyway, Core WCF, Microsoft, Amazon working together to bring a app component type to .NET for their customers, which is really exciting. And you've seen, there was a couple of sessions at .NET Conf, which was in November, about WCF or Core WCF. So if you are a WCF developer today, please take a look at that project because I think there's some value there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about naming conventions going forward. So if anybody here has played around with the newer versions of .NET, you've noticed a couple of things that are substantially different between .NET Framework and .NET 7. Most notably, the project file is completely different, like the CS proj. If you open up a CS proj file in .NET Framework, it's like 100 and some lines, and there's like garbage in there. I have no idea what any of that means. Well, I mean, you're supposed to know, but I don't know because I'm not that great of a developer. On the .NET Core, .NET 7 side, it's substantially smaller because it's simplified. And one of the ways that they wanted to simplify it is by introducing more common framework names and more common TFMs, and we'll talk about what TFMs are in a second. But what basically this framework names are is Net 7.0. So that means that this is for code that runs literally anywhere. And this takes the best of .NET Core 3.1 and .NET Standard 2.1. We'll talk about .NET Standard in a few minutes. After that, if I have specific operating system functionality that I want to light up, for instance, Android, iOS, Windows, Mac Catalyst, whatever, Tizen, which is the operating system for televisions, you then add a dash and then what that platform is. And that's what a TFM is, Target Framework Moniker. So what that does is that helps the runtime say, oh, you need these additional OS-specific bits for your application. That all make sense? Cool. Because if it didn't, there's a little illustrated representation of it. So everything on the bottom here, this is like what the base simplified framework names are. And everything in this brownish color are TFMs. And everything that's inside of netx.y, so in the future it'll be net 8.0, net 9.0. This includes the latest and final versions of .NET Core and the latest and final versions of .NET Standard. So Isaac, I need to target Microsoft libraries, right? And if I'm building a new app, like those new Microsoft libraries that I'm targeting, like what are they written in? It's quite simple. Any library, and when I mean library, I mean like using system.data, system.collection.generic, system.link, whatever. Those are libraries, and if they're cross-platform, Net 7.0 is what they'll be written in. Also, if there are specific Windows functionality, so WPF or WinForms or Manage UWP, that's going to have that TFM of Net 7.0-Windows. And Net 7.0, if you're using things like MAUI, Xamarin Essentials, Xamarin Forms, if you're basically doing mobile development, you can use Net 7.0. But if you are leveraging a library that could potentially be called from a .NET Framework application, as well as a .NET 7 application, that library is going to be targeting .NET Standard. Well, let's talk a little bit about what .NET Standard is. So .NET Standard, and again, oversimplification, it's a contract to a fixed set of APIs that are written to work on any platform. And how it works is the higher the version of .NET Standard you have, the more APIs that you have access to. But the lower the number, the more platforms you support. So here's an example. If you compare .NET Standard 1.6 versus .NET Standard 2.0, 2.0 is going to give you way more API surface. So you have substantially more APIs to leverage. But you might not have support in Windows 8, for instance, or other particular platform types that you might need to target for your apps. So there is a balance that you need to take. Like, what do I actually need when I'm building this application? But when you're building libraries today, like what platform, what framework should you be targeting? The short answer is if you are building a library, a class library that needs to be leveraged, needs to be called from a .NET 7 or a .NET Framework application, use .NET Standard still. If there are specific pieces of functionality like span of T or some of the other things that are interested in .NET Standard 2.1, you can do that. But if you're just building a library that's going to be called just from .NET 7 applications going forward, that library, that class library itself, can also be .NET 7. It doesn't need to be some other version. All right, so we've been talking for like a half hour, and I've given you like a history lesson of .NET. And like the name of the talk is like, what do I do with my old framework applications? So I lied to you for like a half hour, right? This is where we're going to start talking about what we can actually look to implement as we try to make the migration, the modernization of these .NET framework applications to later versions of .NET 7. And the first thing I'll lead off with is like, this is very much your mileage may vary. Like depending on how many projects you have. I talked to a gentleman a couple months ago that had 135 projects in their solution. And they were like .NET Framework 3.5. And I was like, can you get them to 4.8? And he's like, maybe. I'm like, well, probably just do that. So what I like to do when I have conversations with folks like that is lay out just kind of a typical workflow as it pertains to building a plan of attack to actually do this work. Because if you just start trying to do it, you're going to get overwhelmed almost immediately. But if you segment it into individual chunks of work, you'll notice that it's probably not as terrifying as one might think. And the first step is preparation. And this is my favorite part, my favorite step, because there are decent tools to help us doing that. So, for instance, if I have like 30 projects in my solution, right? I need to take an inventory of all the NuGet packages that are being referenced from all those projects, all of the .NET APIs that are being leveraged, there's loose assemblies there, all sorts of stuff. And I need to itemize and inventory that. Otherwise, I'm going to be confused in a week after I go on vacation and come back and say, oh, what was I doing? Oh, I was upgrading this .NET app, and I have no idea where I am. So building like some assessment, some report that gets us to, hey, this is what we need to do to actually complete our migration, it'll set you up for success. And there are some tools for that. There's the .NET Upgrade Assistant, which is a command line-based tool from Microsoft. And then there's a porting assistant for .NET from AWS, which I'm guessing none of you have heard of. And if you have heard of, awesome. Guy in the back. But you're going to see it at the end, I promise. So some of these tools are really, really great because they actually help you do that itemized step. And again, like this is low-hanging fruit that a machine can do substantially more efficiently and quicker than you can. So it's about limiting the amount of errors that could potentially be reduced if you're doing it yourself. The second step is you can actually take these tools and just click a button and say, hey, do the upgrade for me. And that's not going to work. I can tell you right now it's not going to work. But it'll, again, do some of those low-hanging tasks. Update the project file. Maybe modify a little bit of your source code. It can do some of these things. However, the next step, which is the biggest step, is fixing your code and getting it to build, right? And number 3, like step 3 is like the work, right? Also, when you do step 2, like don't do that in like your main branch or like your dev branch. Like do this somewhere where like, heaven forbid, like, hey Dan, can you like do this feature work that actually brings value to the business instead of upgrading .NET? Who gives a shit about upgrading .NET? Oh yeah, no, I can't really do that right now because I'm in the middle of doing a migration. Well, that's going to go over really well with your client. So do it in a place where you can actually throw it away if you need to and start over again, right? So that's the number one thing, because I've seen so many people just start doing it and they're like, oh no, I need to stop. And like stopping like throws away everything. But then if you try to do feature work in the same place, like you put yourself in a position to fail almost immediately. So as you're going through and fixing your code, you're taking a look at warnings, you're making sure that you're not calling any deprecated methods, all that sort of great stuff. And then once you get it to build, it probably still won't run. So then you go to that next step where okay, it runs locally on my machine. All my unit tests work. Also, make sure your unit test projects are in .NET 7 as well. Because if you do them in a different version, they probably won't work. So then, if you have the opportunity to deploy it out to lower level environments, have some UAT, maybe you have fancy Selenium tests or Playwright tests that do UI testing for you, and then you can go to production using blue-green deployments or something fancy like that too, right? So if I lay it all out like this, does it seem like it's terrifying still? The only thing that's really terrifying is this one, in the grand scheme of things. There's a tool that helps you do this. There's a tool that helps you do this. And this one is just like testing, which is going to suck regardless, right? So the next thing that we want to talk about is, okay, so we did this thing, right? We did this preparation step. That's cool. the most important part of the preparation step is identifying what code can be reused versus what code that needs to get rewritten. Because at the end of the day, you'll probably be very surprised at how much code you can actually just reuse, maybe with some subtle changes. And for instance, if you have an MVC app, most of like model view controllers, like other than like changing some inheritance and a couple of extensions, like it just basically just maps. If you're using business logic, like conditionals and loops, they work in all versions of .NET. Other things, like if you're using some different identity providers, or you're using third-party injection, dependency injection configuration, like a Ninjack or AutoFac or something like that, that code is reusable. And a lot of third-party dependencies, like a lot of these third-party developers who build NuGet packages, they don't want to remove a bunch of people's cheese because people will just yell at them. And as being somebody who maintains open source projects, there's nothing worse than people bothering you, because it's frustrating. So my recommendation for a lot of folks is, say for instance you have this massive web project, right? And there's like thousands of classes in there and all these lines of code. Start moving some of that into a class library, like a .NET Standard 2.0 class library. And over the course of time, chunk by chunk, moving stuff that's reusable. And then the only thing that's left in your web project is code that needs to get rewritten. And you'll probably be surprised at how small that actually is. Mostly it's like, okay, going from like global ASAX and that startup mechanism to like the new startup mechanism in .NET 7. There's configuration stuff. Bundling minification really doesn't work the same way. And then there's some other things that I honestly never used, but a lot of people do, like HTTP modules. That sort of stuff is no longer pertinent in today's world. Also, if you're using web forms or server WCF, there's going to be some migration for you as well. So let's talk a little bit about tools. So I mentioned there's like 2 tools that I'm going to talk about that can help us get from point where we are to point where we want to be. And the first one I'm going to talk about a little bit is the .NET Upgrade Assistant, which is from Microsoft. Like I mentioned, it's a command line based utility. It's open source on GitHub. It supports MVC, WinForms, WPF, class libraries, console apps. And there's basically 2 functions for it. Build me a report, which generates a file that you can't need to open in Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio. Or there's an upgrade, which is just there's doing a bunch of stuff for you in like an interactive style. And we'll actually take a look at that. So that's one option. The next option is my favorite for no reason at all. No, there's no reason why this is my favorite one. No reason. Porting system for .NET for AWS, there's 2 flavors of it. There's a Visual Studio extension, so 2019 or 2022. So if you want to do it inside Visual Studio. There's also a Windows GUI application, like a Windows application that you can open and run. And what it does is it does very similar things to the command line based utility. It can build your report, can actually do the migration for you. It's open source as well on GitHub. You do not need an AWS account to use it. You don't need to be an AWS customer to do it. You don't need to, well, I mean, you need to give me money because I told you about it. But otherwise, it's completely free to use, and I highly recommend you taking a look at it, even if you're not an AWS customer today. It supports versions of .NET Framework from 3.5 and up, and it does .NET Core 3.1 migrations as well, all the way up to .NET 7. It supports MVC, class libraries, and one more that I think is really interesting. So it'll actually port your WCF projects to core WCF. Remember what we were talking about a bit earlier, like it's not officially supported? Well, there's a version 1.0 of it, and we at AWS believe that it's production ready. So we're going to give you an opportunity to do so. And there's a lot of other interesting things we're trying to play around with. We're looking at options to port web forms to Blazor. We're looking at options for other component types as well, and also just better coding practices in general. So definitely, so at the end of this talk, there'll be a short link that I'll leave up for a bit, and there'll be some links to the GitHub repos for this stuff, and also some migration documentation I think is really valuable. So now what I want to do is I want to show a couple of demos. How's that sound? Cool. I mean, I'm not allowed to do a tech talk without a demo. I'd be chased back to Seattle. All right, so what I'm going to start off with is I'm going to start off with the .NET Upgrade Assistant, which is a command line utility. So I have just a simple, let me just zoom in a little bit. I have a simple WinForms application. So this WinForms application has two projects. It has a WinForms project, and it has a class library. So if I open up the class or the project file, you'll see that. You all right? All right. Target framework. So whenever he hears WinForms, he sneezes. So Target Framework version 4.5, right? So it's a 4.5 Windows application. So what I want to be able to do is I want to actually go through this project or the solution using the .NET Upgrade Assistant and port it directly to .NET 7 right before your very eyes. So let's actually do that. So I'm in this project here, and I'm going to go into this matching game folder, and there's a solution folder here, and then I'm just going to upgrade Assistant upgrade, and then point it at a solution file. And then it's going to start doing some stuff. And along the way, it's going to say, hey, Isaac, do you want to do some of these things? So the first thing it's going to do is, OK, you provided me a solution. There's multiple entry points. Let's select your entry point. And I'll say, OK, let's do that. And I'll say, OK, select which project you want to start with. Well, OK, I want to start with the WinForms application. So let's try that. Let's do that. However, it's then going to say, do you want to select this project? Say, OK, sure, let's do that. Select this project. That's not a good idea, because this project is dependent on a class library. You want to do the class library first. So it's smart enough to actually detect that, which I think is super cool. I'll say, OK, sure, computer, I'll trust you. And then the next thing it's going to do is, OK, it's going to list out all of these steps. Let's maximize this. It's going to list out all these steps that it's going to actually start to do. And the first one it wants is like, let's back up this project because, you might mess it up pretty bad. But I've done this a million times, and I'm never going to back up my project again. So I'm just going to skip. So the next thing it wants us to do is it wants us to convert that project file to the new SDK style. So remember I talked about earlier that the project files are substantially more readable. Also, you can open them in Visual Studio, which is pretty cool. So it'll actually convert that for you. So let's actually do that step. So it's going to convert that style to us. And we can actually open this up in Visual Studio Code. Let me just close this out and take a look, minimize this. So as you can see, on the left-hand side, there's 49 lines in this particular project file, and now there's 11. This isn't going to build, but this is the first step in getting it to build. So the next thing it's going to want to do is it's going to want to start running compatibility checks. So both of these tools use what are called Roslyn analyzers to basically check code and making sure that you're following particular programming practices and doing things the particular way you're supposed to in the latest version of .NET. In order to be able to do that, it needs to add those analyzers to your project, and that's what it's going to do in this step. So we'll do that. It's going to add a line here. Get out of here. Scroll down right here. So Microsoft, .NET Upgrade Assistant, default analyzers, right? So, and then we're just going to keep on walking through this. And then the next step, which is probably the most important part, is going to update the TFM. And remember, the TFM is our Target Framework moniker. So it says update TFM to Net Standard 2.0. But I thought I was going to upgrade this project to .NET 7. The reason why it does .NET Standard is because, hey, this project is being called from a .NET Framework application. So I'm not going to make it .NET 7 because that'll break everything. So we're going to do .NET Standard. So it's intelligent enough to recognize context of the solution. All right, so, and then it does a whole bunch of other reference analyzers, and then it says, OK, you're good. Let's move on to the next project. So let's do that. So the next project is just a little bit more complicated because it's a WinForms project. But again, it's still pretty straightforward. The same process as before. I'm not going to back up. And I'm going to upgrade, or I'm going to modify the project file. We can actually take a look at what that looks like. So open this one up. So on the left-hand side, it was 89 lines, and now it's 16. Again, still not going to build, but it just shows you how more simplified the project files are now. And then it's going to update and add those reference analyzers, like I mentioned earlier. Do that. It's going to update our TFM. Our TFM is Net 7.0-Windows. So it does that for us, and we can validate that by going here, Net 7.0-Windows. And then on to the next step is it's going to run Windows Compatibility Pack. So the latest versions of Windows require WinForms and WFPF projects to follow particular standards, specifically like having default font set, also having specific DPI settings configured. Those are requirements of Windows. So it recognizes that, hey, you have a WinForms application, you're probably not following the newer standards of Windows, so we're going to do that for you. And how it actually does that is it actually adds some code, right? So let's actually go to that line right there. So get to that step. It's going to add that Windows source updater like I mentioned. And then, whoops. And then as you can see, it updated some source code for us. So what did it actually do? In this particular case, it didn't do anything absolutely insane. So let's open this up. It added one line of code to basically set the high DPI mode to system.aware, right? So nothing crazy, but it actually modified source code for us to make sure that we're adhering to the requirements of Windows. So move on to the next project, finalize the upgrade, and now we're done. So if I was to go into this matching game project and I was to do like .NET Run, what do you think would happen? Do you think it's going to blow up or work? I've done this before, many times. Hooray! Simple matching game, right? Every now and then I actually do get a match and I get super excited. Anyway, so again, like no one's business is built on the backs of a matching game. But it shows you what you can do with some tools. So that's one tool that I think is really important and really valuable. So let's actually close out of some stuff and show another tool. Not that window. So this tool, unable to check, oh, internet connection, cool. Don't worry about that because I opened this when it wasn't connected to the internet. So this is the porting system for .NET. So this is a tool from AWS, like I mentioned, free to use, don't need an AWS account, don't need an AWS customer to use it, that will do a similar thing, but it uses a graphical interface. And like I mentioned earlier, there is a Visual Studio extension for it as well. So the first thing that you want to do is when you open this project up, you want to assess a new solution. And then you just point it at a particular solution file, and then it'll start to run those analyzers against it. So sometimes it takes a long time. And in this particular case, I'm going to just show you a solution that actually works. I ran this earlier. Oh, no. Hold on. Let me just close this, open this again. I think I got broke because I wasn't connected to the internet when I opened it. There we go. Weird how that just happened. So I found a project that is not huge. It's also not very small. So who here has heard of the NOP Commerce project? So if you haven't heard about it, it is an open source e-commerce platform that you can get on GitHub. So for instance, you can go out to GitHub today, you can clone that project or fork it, and you can use it as inspiration to build an e-commerce presence for your business today. So if you have a company that's in the retail space and you have an e-commerce store, maybe look at that. It'll get you started a bit quicker. But what I wanted to be able to do is I wanted to actually take an older version of this, so .NET 4.5.1, and I wanted to run an assessment against it. So when I click Assess, it starts to generate all sorts of really valuable information for me right from the get-go. So really important top-level information like the number of incompatible NuGet packages, the amount of incompatible APIs that's being called, if there are particular build errors here. It also does this at each individual project level. I can also do things like look at a project reference graph, which gives me a topological view of all of the dependencies for my particular solution. I mean, like this just by itself is like worth it. Because how many times has somebody asked you like, we have like a bunch of projects in the solution, like how are they all related to each other? And you're like, oh, hold on, let me just create a mapping document in Excel and like I'll get back to you by the end of the day. Or you can just run this tool and it'll take like 15 seconds. So this also gives you a really, an understanding of like what projects maybe you should be looking to target. Like, for instance, this is NLP Core project. It's being referenced by every other project. Maybe we take that project and upgrade it to .NET Standard. And then we can start to pick and choose some of the other projects along the way, and before you know it, we have a lot of projects that are upgraded. So that's one really cool thing. And I can zoom in and zoom out here, which is pretty awesome. But I can also take a look at individual projects. What are some of the things that are interesting? So let's open up this NLP service project. And then I'll start listing out all the NuGet packages this project referenced and whether or not the newer versions of those packages are compatible with .NET 7 or not. So that by itself is very, very valuable too. So for instance, iTech#, it's not compatible with .NET 7. That's a bummer. But MaxMind GeoIP2, the newest version of that, which is 2.8, is, which is really, really valuable. You can then do that one level down. So taking a look at .NET APIs that are being called and which ones are supported or not supported. So for instance, is null or white space in this particular case and system.out is incompatible in these certain scenarios, maybe because there's a newer extension for it, right? And then, which is even better, I can actually take a look at source code, and it will actually call out individual lines of code and say, this is an incompatible method invocation, aka you're going to have to rewrite this code, right? So that's super valuable because it's doing the work for you in a lot of cases. And again, this is just about building like an assessment of what needs to get done. If I want to, I can actually go back out. Oops, I went back out too far. And then I can click this port solution button. I do not recommend doing that for a large project because it will not work. But what if I told you sometimes it just does work? So who here has heard of Newtonsoft.json? Everybody in the room. It's the #1 downloaded NuGet package, probably because it was in ASP.NET Core for a long time. But it's the de facto standard for serializing and deserializing JSON data. So I took an older version of that GitHub project, so the .NET 4.5 version of it, and I ported it to .NET 7 using this tool. So I did that earlier today. And what I want to do is I want to show you what we can do after we've ported that project. So I'm going to create a new project here. I'm just going to create like a console project, and then I'm going to call into that library that I upgraded. So let's actually console. Let's see if Visual Studio is going to be slow today or not. Visual Studio is always slow. Don't be on previews, kids. I'm just going to do this. Oh, never mind. All right, I'm just going to call this console app 1, because why not? So I want this to be on .NET Standard, Standard Term Support. So this is going to create, if you haven't seen the new templates for .NET, you're probably like, where the hell is everything? This is the more minimized version of the templates for .NET. But basically what I want to be able to do, get away, Copilot. What I want to do is I want to take this project and I want to I want to serialize and deserialize some JSON data with there. So I'm going to add a reference to an existing project, and I'm going to go to this ported folder, which I created, and I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to specify a particular project. And if I open this one up, as you can see here, it's .NET 7, because I ported it earlier. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to, let me just zoom in a little bit. I'm just going to write some really awesome code that nobody will ever use. So I'm just going to create like a list of strings, right? So it's a new list of string, and in here, there's foo, and there's bar, right? So super exciting. Actually, I'll zoom out. Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to take that list and I want to serialize it as JSON. So I can do that by going JSON convert, and then do control dot, not that control dot. No, do not give me that one. All right, let's just do this then. Let's add a reference. I was hoping the Visual Studio wouldn't force me to use system.text.json, but it was doing it anyway. Okay, and it's still doing it. All right, using soft.json. All right, so and then I want to serialize this object. So I'm going to serialize list, and then that's just going to be a string. So I can just console.write this out. Right, and then just for grins, let's just actually create another list, and then let's just JSON convert, deserialize. We want this to be a list of string, and then pass in JSON, right? So basically all I'm doing here, and then I'm just going to do a read line at the bottom so it doesn't close the console window. So basically all I'm doing here is I am creating a new C# object, a .NET object, a list of strings with foo bar in them, and then I'm going to serialize it into text, a JSON of that text, and then I'm going to write it out, and then I'm going to deserialize it back. I know this is a very stupid demo, but I'm just showing you that I was able to take a .NET Framework 4.5 project, port it to .NET 7, and call it in a .NET 7 project, and it just magically worked, right? So as you can see, super exciting, worst demo ever. So these two tools here, the Upgrade Assistant as well as the Porting Assistant, they're very to help you get from where you are to where you want to be, right? And at this point in time, like that's my talk. So this is a link here to the GitHub repositories that I was mentioning for the two different projects, the Upgrade Assistant as well as the Porting Assistant, and then a couple of white papers on modernizing .NET applications. Yeah, so that's me. I'm Isaac. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them out. And also, just let me know in general if you would use that porting system for .NET from AWS, because I have a PM who really, really wants me to talk about it as much as possible, and I love doing it. So that's me. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming out. And thank you for being so inviting. Drinks. I have all this wires attached to me. It's great. So thank you. If anybody has any questions, you can ask them, or you can come up and we can chat privately. Yes, sir.
Hi. Does it deal with transitive dependencies and also migrating from packages config format to
Which one?
either of those tools?
Yeah.
Because I've done a lot of this by hand in the past,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things where it can be really useful for that.
Yeah. So I haven't tried it specifically with package. Which version of .NET? Which version of .NET are you running? Is it 4.8 or?
Something from 4.8.
Yeah. But using packages.config instead of
Would have been written
Yeah.
at the time.
I believe it will. But if you want to shoot me a note, I can definitely double check that for you. It does. It does. Yeah. Because
The other thing is, because you could right click and make that
yeah.
for you automatically with the video anyway.
Yeah.
It's the resolving all the transitive dependencies and not needing them anymore bit, which is quite nice.
Yeah.
That part of it is, if it's not a net standard or anything like that, so you need to make sure all your dependencies are net standard or whatever compatible before you go for it.
Yeah. The benefit to that, though, is that most of the major NuGet package or third-party providers, like they have a .NET Standard version, like they were pretty quick to get on the .NET Standard train because they knew they would lose developers. I haven't seen that many projects that could be cross-platform that don't have a .NET Standard version. So I mean, I think that just shows you the value of the .NET community. Like they saw an opportunity to innovate and modernize, and they just did it, even though it was a pain for a lot of them. Anybody have any other questions? If not, I have a question for you. Which one of those tools do you like more? You can be honest. The one that works when you try it tomorrow. That's a good answer.
I'm going to try both.
You should try both. I'm not saying you should try one or the other, but you should definitely like one more than the other.
Which one's that, Isaac?
Sorry, say it again, sir?
The porting system looks cool, but I have used the upgrade system.
Yeah. The upgrade system is... Yep.
A couple of apps, I think it was up to .NET 5 at the time.
Yeah.
Was the new one.
Yeah.
One of them was coming from, might have been 3.1,
Yeah.
I think, and it just works.
Yeah.
I didn't have to do anything.
Yeah, again, like both the tools work. I think it's a matter of taste, right? Like, do you like the feeling of going through that interactive mode with the command line? Or, I think the number one value prop that I have for the porting assistant is you can do this, right? Like you can open it up and go to this, and you can like export a report, right? And you can hand that to somebody in the business, and they're like, tell me why this is so important, and you're like, because this is all the stuff that's outdated and like it no longer has support, and you can maybe get a little bit of traction that way. Like that's really, really valuable. Like, I mean, we've all been doing this long enough. Like, upgrading from .NET Framework to .NET 6 like doesn't bring business value, like at least in the minds of a lot of folks. So, having tools that can help you plead your case will, save yourself in the future, right? Awesome. Anybody have other comments? Yeah.
Yeah, so the last couple of months I've been looking to upgrade an MVC 5
Mm-hmm.
not that framework, full 6 application.
Are we still recording?
From Microsoft, and it did give me an idea of what it could
Yeah. No, I mean, so I'll just tell you, I'll just show you straight away, right? So when I joined AWS in July, it required you to have an AWS account. Like the first conversation that I had with the PM was like, you need to get rid of that. Because this is so valuable to the developer community that even though you're not getting telemetry or customer usage information, you're showing the community that you care about modernizing .NET. And we were able to plead that case with the business, and it was removed. So that's like, it's been like 3 or 4 months now. So if you haven't tried it, if you haven't tried it recently, please make sure you get the latest version and try again. They shouldn't prompt you for an AWS account or anything like that.
So there's no telemetry, like stats and the number of people using it and that kind of thing?
We have stuff because a lot of the analyzer calls aren't actually done on the box. They're web service calls. So we do have some telemetry tracking. Like we have an idea of like which projects, like which NuGet packages are used a lot by our customers.
Does any code get sent out, or is it all
Nope.
open?
No. The only thing that we send is metadata, right? Like that. I mean, especially talking to folks in Europe, in the UK, right? Like we do not want to get sued. So like we want to make sure that no PII, nor source code, no anything like that. It's strictly just metadata. And in the links, there's quite a bit of documentation, and so there's 3 or 4 GitHub repositories that make up the porting assistant, and one of them is literally just the language rules, and it'll tell you point blankly like what it's actually doing underneath the hood. So we're trying to be as transparent as possible because we understand that like, we're supposed to just trust this magic thing that like upgrades our code for us. Like, no, that's not going to work for us, right? So that's like the number one thing. So like all the code that you see, or all the functionality that you see when you use the tool, it's open source on GitHub that you can look at yourself.
So if you've got some form of telemetry, have you seen a massive spike since you stopped the requirement of having a native US account?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say massive. I still think that there's tons of opportunity, hence why I'm here, talking about it. Because I think that, and you and I have talked about this a bit, like when I was on your show, like, we're looking at opportunities to raise the awareness of hosting .NET applications on AWS, right? So that includes a whole scheme of things, like actually running apps on AWS, but also using AWS tools for .NET, like Core WCF. Like it's not an AWS tool, but AWS is a major contributor to it. The porting assistant. We also have other tools like app-to-container or microservice extractor, which do those things for you. Like we literally have a piece of software that you can point it at like a set of controllers, and it'll break all those controllers out into microservices for you. And you can then literally click it and it'll deploy it to a Kubernetes cluster for you. So like, I mean like, grand scheme, like, oh, that sounds terrifying, but like there are tools that a lot of people aren't aware of that they could probably get some value out of. And again, I'm the first one to preach, like none of these tools are going to save your day, but they can help you in the future save your day. Right? Because at the end of the day, like, we're not getting replaced by ChatGPT, I'm telling you. Like, we're going to have to do a lot of the same stuff that we've been doing, but we have to use tools to be more successful. So that's my rant. Yeah, so this is great. I enjoyed myself, so thank you so much for having me. You don't need to clap again. Oh, please clap some more. Awesome.